The complete works of Swami Vivekananda, Practical Vedanta, The Ideal of a Universal Religion, Part 2. What then do I mean by the ideal of a universal religion? I do not mean any one universal philosophy or any one universal mythology or any one universal religion held alike by all. For I know that this world must go on working, wheel within wheel, this intricate mass of machinery, most complex, most wonderful. What can we do then? We can make it run smoothly. We can lessen the friction. We can grease the wheels, as it were. How? By recognizing the necessary and natural necessity of variation. Just as we have recognized unity by our very nature, so also we must recognize variation. We must learn that truth may be expressed in 100,000 ways, and that each of these ways is true as far as it goes. We must learn that the same thing can be viewed from 100 different standpoints and yet be the same. Take, for instance, the sun. Suppose a man standing on the earth looks at the sun. When it rises in the morning, he sees a big ball. Suppose he starts on a journey toward the sun and takes a camera with him, taking photographs at every stage of his journey until he reaches the sun. The photographs of each stage will be seen to be different from those of the other stages. In fact, when he gets back, he brings with him so many photographs of so many different suns, as it would appear, and yet we know that the same sun was photographed by the man at different stages of his progress. Even so, it is with the Lord. Through high philosophy or low, and through the most exalted mythology or the grossest, through the most refined ritualism or errant fetishism, every sect, every soul, every nation, every religion, consciously or unconsciously, is struggling upward towards God. Every vision of truth that man has is a vision of him and of none else. Suppose we all go with vessels in our hands to fetch water from a lake. One has a cup, another a jar, another a bucket, and so forth. And we all fill our vessels. The water in each case naturally takes the form of the vessel carried by each of us. He who brought the cup has the water in the form of a cup. He who brought the jar, his water is in the shape of the jar, and so forth. But in every case, water and nothing but water is in the vessel. So it is in the case of religion. Our minds are like these vessels, and each one of us is trying to arrive at the realization of God. God is like that water filling these different vessels, and in each vessel the vision of God comes in the form of the vessel. Yet He is one. He is God in every sense. This is the only recognition of universality that we can get. So far, it is all right theoretically. But is there a way of practically working out this harmony in religions? We find that this recognition that all the various views of religion are true has been very old. Hundreds of attempts have been made in India, in Alexandria, in Europe, in China, in Japan, in Tibet, and lastly in America, to formulate a harmonious religious creed to make all religions come together in love. They have all failed because they did not adopt any practical plan. Many have admitted that all the religions of the world are right, but they show no practical way of bringing them together so as to enable each of them to maintain its own individuality in the conflux. That plan alone is practical, which does not destroy the individuality of any man in religion, and at the same time shows him a point of union with all others. But so far, all the plans of religious harmony that have been tried, while proposing to take in all the various views of religion, have in practice tried to bind all down to a few doctrines, and so have produced more new sects fighting, struggling, and pushing each other. I have also my little plan. I do not know whether it will work or not, and I want to present it to you for a discussion. What is my plan? In the first place, I would ask mankind to recognize this maxim: do not destroy. Iconoclastic reformers do no good to the world. Break not, pull not down anything, but build. Help if you can. If you cannot, fold your hands and stand by and see things go on. Do not injure. If you cannot, render help. Say not a word against any man's convictions, so far as they are sincere. Secondly, take man where he stands, and from there give him a lift. If it be true that God is at the center of all religions, and that each of us is moving towards him along one of these radii, then it is certain that all of us must reach that center. And at the center where all the radii meet, all our differences will cease. But until we reach there, differences there must be. All these radii converge at the same center. One, according to his nature, travels along one of these lines, and another along another. And if we all push onward towards along our own lines, we shall surely come to the center, because all roads lead to Rome. Each of us is naturally growing and developing according to his own nature. Each will in time come to know the highest truth, for after all, men must teach themselves. What can you and I do? Do you think you can teach even a child? You cannot. The child teaches it himself. Your duty is to afford opportunities and to remove obstacles. A plant grows. Do you make the plant grow? Your duty is to put a hedge around it and see that no animal eats up the plant, and there your duty ends. The plant grows of itself. So it is in regard to the spiritual growth of every man. None can teach you. None can make a spiritual man of you. You have to teach yourself. Your growth must come from inside. What can an external teacher do then? He can remove the obstructions a little, but there his duty ends. Therefore, help if you can, but do not destroy. Give up all ideas that you can make men spiritual. It is impossible. There is no other teacher to you than your own soul. Recognize this. What comes of it? In society, we see so many different natures. There are thousands and thousands of varieties of minds and inclinations. A thorough generalization of each is impossible. But for our practical purpose, it is sufficient to have them characterized into 4 classes. First, there is the active man, the worker. He wants to work, and there is tremendous energy in his muscles and his nerves. His aim is to work, to build hospitals, do charitable deeds, make streets, to plan and to organize. Then there is the emotional man, who loves the sublime and the beautiful to an excessive degree. He loves to think of the beautiful to enjoy the aesthetic side of nature and adore love and the God of love. He loves with his whole heart the great souls of all times, the prophets of religions, and the incarnations of God on earth. He does not care whether reason can or cannot prove that Christ or Buddha existed. He does not care for the exact date when the Sermon on the Mount was preached or for the exact moment of Krishna's birth. What he cares for is their personalities, their lovable figures. Such is his ideal. This is the nature of the lover, the emotional man. Then there is the mystic, whose mind wants to analyze its own self, to understand the workings of the human mind, what the forces are that work inside, and how to know, manipulate, and obtain control over them. This is the mystical mind. Then there is the philosopher who wants to weigh everything and use his intellect even beyond the possibilities of all human philosophy. Now, a religion to satisfy the largest proportion of mankind must be able to supply food for all these various types of minds. And where this capability is wanting, the existing sects all become one-sided. Suppose you go to a sect which preaches love and emotion. They sing and weep and preach love. But as soon as you say, my friend, that is all right, but I want something stronger than this, a little reason and philosophy, I want to understand things step by step and more rationally, then they say, get out. And they not only ask you to get out, but they would send you to the other place if they could. The result is that that sect can only help people of an emotional turn of mind. They not only do not help others, but also try to actually destroy them. And the most wicked part of the whole thing is that they will not only not help others, but do not believe in their sincerity. Again, there are philosophers who talk of the wisdom of India and the East and use big psychological terms, 50 syllables long. But if an ordinary man like me goes to them and says, can you tell me anything to make me spiritual? The first thing they would do is to smile and say, oh, you are too far below us in your reason. What can you understand about spirituality? These are high up philosophers. They simply show you the door. Then they are the mystical sects who speak all sorts of things about different planes of existence, different states of mind, and what the power of the mind can do, and so on. And if you are an ordinary man and say, show me anything good that I can do, I am not much given to speculation, can you give me anything that will suit me? They will smile and say, listen to that fool, he knows nothing. His existence is for nothing. And this is going on everywhere in the world. I would like to get extreme exponents of all these different sects and shut them up in a room and photograph their beautiful, derisive smiles. This is the existing condition of religion, the existing condition of things. What I want to propagate is a religion that will be equally acceptable to all minds. It must be equally philosophic, equally emotional, equally mystic, and equally conducive to action. If professors from the colleges come, scientific men and physicists will quote reason. Let them have it as much as they want. There will be a point beyond which they will think they cannot go without breaking with reason. They will say, these ideas of God and salvation are superstitious. Guise them up. And I say, Mr. Philosopher, this body of yours is a bigger superstition. Give it up. Don't go home to dinner or to your philosophic chair. Give up the body, and if you cannot, cry quarter and sit down. For religion must be able to show how to realize the philosophy that teaches us that this world is one, that there is but one existence in the universe. Similarly, if the mystic comes, we must welcome him, be ready to give him the science of mental analysis, and practically demonstrate it before him. And if the emotional people come, we must sit, laugh, and weep with them in the name of the Lord. We must drink the cup of love and become mad. If the energetic worker comes, we must work with him with all the energy that we have. And this combination will be the ideal of the nearest approach to a universal religion. Would to God that all men were so constituted in their minds, all these elements of philosophy, mysticism, emotion, and of work were equally present in full. That is the ideal, my ideal of a perfect man. Everyone who has only one or two of these elements of character, I would consider a one-sided person. And this world is almost so full of such one-sided men, with knowledge of that one road only in which they move, and anything else is dangerous and horrible to them. To become harmoniously balanced in all these four directions is my ideal of religion. And this religion is attained by what we in India call yoga, union. To the worker, it is union between men and the whole of humanity. To the mystic, between his lower and higher self. To the lover, the union between himself and the God of love. And to the philosopher, it is the union of all existence. This is what is meant by yoga. This is a Sanskrit term, and these four divisions of yoga have in Sanskrit different names. The man who seeks after this kind of union is called a yogi. The worker is called the Karam Yogi. He who seeks the union through love is called the Bhakti Yogi. He who seeks it through mysticism is called the Raj Yogi. And he who seeks it through philosophy is called the Jnana Yogi. So this word yogi comprises them all. Now first of all, let me take up Raj Yoga. What is this Raj Yoga, this controlling of the mind? In this country, you are all sorts of hobgoblins with the world of yoga, I am afraid. Therefore, I must start by telling you that it has nothing to do with such things. No one of these yogas gives up reason. No one of them asks you to be hoodwinked or to deliver your reason into the hands of priests of any type whatsoever. No one of them asks you that you should give your allegiance to any superhuman messenger. But each one of them tells you to cling to your reasons and to hold fast to it. We find in all beings three sorts of instruments of knowledge. The first is instinct, which you must most find in the most highly developed in animals. This is the lowest instrument of knowledge. Which is the second instrument of knowledge? Reasoning. You find the most highly developed in man. Now, in the first place, instinct is an inadequate instrument to animals. The sphere of action is very limited, and within that limit, instinct acts. When you come to man, you see it is a largely developed into reason. The sphere of action also here has been enlarged. Yet, even reason is still very insufficient. Reason can only go a little way and then there it stops. It cannot go any further. And if you try to push it, the result is helpless confusion. Reason itself becomes unreasonable. Logic becomes argument in a circle. Take, for instance, the very basis of our perception, matter and force. What is matter? That which is acted upon by force. And force? That which acts upon matter. You see the complication, what the logicians call seesaw, one idea depending on the other, and this again depending on that. You find a mighty barrier before reason, beyond which reasoning cannot go. Yet it always feels impatient to get into the region of the infinite beyond. This world, this universe which our senses feel or our mind thinks, is but one atom, so to say, of the infinite, projected onto the plane of consciousness. And within that narrow limit defined by the network of our consciousness works our reason and not beyond. Therefore, there must be some other instrument to take us beyond, and that instrument is called inspiration. So, instinct, reason, and inspiration are the three instruments of knowledge. Instinct belongs to the animals, reason to man, and inspiration to God man. But in all human beings are to be found in more or less developed condition the germs of all these three instruments of knowledge. To have these mental instruments evolved, the germs must be there. And this must also be remembered that one instrument is the development of the other, and therefore does not contradict it. It is the reason that develops into inspiration, and therefore inspiration does not contradict reason, but fulfills it. Things which reason cannot get are brought to light by inspiration, and they do not contradict reason. The old man does not contradict the child, but fulfills the child. Therefore, you must always bear in mind the great danger lying in mistaking the lower form of an instrument to be the higher. Many times instinct is presented before the world as inspiration. And then comes all the spurious claims for the gift of prophecy. A fool or semi-lunatic thinks that the confusion going on in his brain is inspiration, and he wants men to follow him. The most contradictory, irrational nonsense has been preached in the world simply because of this instinctive jargon of confused lunatic brains trying to pass for the language of inspiration.